The Good Earth, Chapter 7. Lotus moves in. It might have gone on forever like this until all the silver was spent, but then Wang Lung's uncle suddenly returned. He did not explain where he had been. He just stood there in the doorway in his ragged clothes, grinning at them as they ate breakfast. Wang Lung looked at him surprised. He had forgotten that his uncle was alive, and it was like a dead man returning. Wang Lung invited him in to eat, and the uncle helped himself freely to everything on the table. Then he said, as though it was his right, "Now I will sleep. I haven't slept in 3 days." Wang Lung led his uncle to his father's bed, not knowing what else to do. When the uncle saw the good furniture and bedding in the room, he said, "Well, I heard you were rich, but I did not know you were as rich as this." Then he threw himself on the bed as if it were his own. He was asleep within moments. Wang Lung was very upset, for he knew that his uncle would never leave. Not only that, but his wife and son would be moving in too. Wang Lung had no choice but to let them, for that was the custom. As long as Wang Lung had money to spare, he had to take care of his family. 3 days after his uncle moved in, Wang Lung was still angry about it. Olan said, "Stop being angry. This is something we must do." And Wang Lung knew that she was right. Then his thoughts turned more strongly than ever to Lotus. He said to himself, when a man's house is full of wild dogs, he must seek peace elsewhere. Now what Olan and Wang Lung's father had not seen, his uncle's wife saw right away. "Your man is mad over another woman," she told Olan. Wang Lung was trying to nap in his room when he overheard this. He was instantly wide awake and listened as she spoke. Her voice went on. "I have seen it before. When a man buys new clothes and shoes and bathes every day, there is a new woman. Don't be surprised when he decides to bring her to this house to live. All men do so. My own husband would certainly do the same if he were rich enough." Until that point, Wang Lung hadn't even thought of moving Lotus into his house. But now he saw a way to satisfy his longing for this girl he loved. He would buy her and bring her to his house. No other man could spend time with her again. While the matter was being arranged, Wang Lung called his workers to him. He told them to build an addition to his house. He wanted another court behind the middle room. Around the court, he wanted 3 rooms, 1 large and 2 small. When the rooms were finished, he had bricks brought in. He had the workers add a good brick floor to the 3 rooms for Lotus, and he bought red cloth to hang on the doors for curtains. He bought furniture, including a large bed with flowered curtains around it. Then he had a little pool made in the center of the court. He lined it with tiles and bought 5 goldfish for it. During all this time, he said nothing to his family except to scold them. One morning, Olan burst into tears and wept aloud. "I have given you sons," she moaned. "I have given you sons." He was ashamed of himself, and so he stopped scolding her for little things. It was true that he had no reason to complain about his wife. There was no reason for him to have Lotus move in, except that he wanted to. One shining day towards the end of summer, Lotus came to his house. From afar, Wang Lung saw her coming. She rode in a closed chair of bamboo, carried by men on men's shoulders. When she arrived at the gate and stepped out of the chair, she kept her eyes lowered. She was leaning on Kukua, unable to walk by herself. It was all part of the arrangement that Kukua was also to live there as a servant to Lotus. As Lotus passed, Wang Lung did not speak. She did not speak to him. She only whispered to Kukua, "Where is my apartment?" Not long after that, Wang Lung dared to lift the red curtain and go into the court he had built for Lotus. Then he went into the darkened room where she was. He stayed with her the whole day. All this time, Olan did not come near the house. At dawn, she had left with a hoe, her children, and some food. When night came, she returned with the children to the house and said nothing to anyone. She went to the kitchen and made dinner as she always did. She helped the old man and the elder girl to eat, and then she ate a little. While Wang Lung still sat at his table dreaming, she got ready for bed. At last, she went to her room and slept alone upon her bed. Wang Lung spent every day with Lotus. All day, she would lie in the cool darkness of her room, eating fine foods and wearing green silk clothing. It was not to be thought that the coming of Lotus and Kukua into Wang Lung's house caused no problems. More than one woman under one roof is never peaceful. The first thing he saw was that Olan would have nothing to do with Cuckoo. This surprised him because he was prepared for Olan to hate Lotus, but he was not expected that she would take out her anger on Cuckoo. Of course, Lotus needed a servant, since she could barely walk. No one would have expected Olan to serve her, but the idea that his uncle's wife serving Lotus did not appeal to Wang Lung. He didn't want his uncle's wife peeping and prying into his business. So Cuckoo was the only choice. Cuckoo tried to be friendly to Olan, but Olan would not even speak to her. She remembered how Cuckoo had always mistreated her when they were both slaves in the great house. Now that they were under the same roof again, Olan didn't like it. "It is a bitter thing in my own house," she said. "And I have no mother's house to go back to." As she left the room, she felt for the door because her tears were blinding her. Wang Lung was ashamed, but he said to himself, "Well, other men do the same. I have been good enough to her. There are worse men than I. Olan will just have to bear it." But Olan never had anything to do with Kukua. She would not even give her heated water to make for Lotus. When Wang Lung asked her to give Kukua hot water in the morning, she said, "No, I am not a slave of slaves in this house." "But it is not for the servant, it is for her mistress," said Wang Lung. Olan said, "And to that one you gave my 2 pearls." And that was the only time Olan ever said a thing about Lotus. She was too proud to ever mention her name or even complain about her. Wang Lung soon had another kitchen built for Kukua and Lotus. He could see that Olan would never share hers. He thought of all his troubles were over at last, but he soon decided that Kukua was buying very expensive foods. Some were foods he had never heard of before. Day after day, the food cost him a lot of money, and there was no one to whom he could complain. He began to notice that his love for Lotus was beginning to cool a bit. There was yet more trouble for Wang Lung. One day, he heard a shriek from Lotus in the inner courts. The twins had been led into the inner courts by the elder daughter, for his poor fool. The younger children were, of course, curious about the lady who lived in the inner courts. Lotus had complained many times about Wang Lung's children, but he had said to her, "They like to see a pretty face as much as their father does." He told them not to enter her courts, but sometimes they did anyway. This day, the daughter had gone to Lotus's room with the twins, where she saw the bright silk clothing and the shading jade earrings on Lotus. She laughed aloud. Lotus was frightened, and she screamed and shook a finger at the poor girl. Then she said, "I will not stay here if that idiot comes near me. I was not told if such one lived here. If I had known, I never would have come." Then a deep anger awoke in Wang Lung, for he loved his children. He said, "You will not speak like that about my children." He was very mad at Lotus, that she would say such things about his poor fool. For 2 days, he would not go near Lotus and instead played with his children. When he finally went back to Lotus, she tried to make it up to him, but he never loved her the same way again. Finally, the floods were gone and it was time to work the fields again. Wang Lung said, "Where is the hoe and where is the plow? And where is the seeds for planting? Come, Ching, my friend, call the men. I go out to the land." Wang Lung was healed of his sickness of love by the dark good by the good dark earth of his fields. He worked hard and found joy in doing so. It seemed to Wang Lung that he had been away from the earth too long. Suddenly, he could see everything that had to be done. He worked every morning and came in at noon for a meal Olan had made. And when he went to Lotus, smelling of garlic and cabbage, he laughed and cared nothing about it. Now he was full of health again and free of the sickness of his love. So the two women took their place in his house, and Wang Lung felt proud when other men in the village talked about the envy of Lotus. They knew that Wang Lung could afford to have her, and because he could afford her, he could have her with no shame, for such was custom. The men in the village looked at Wang Lung with more respect. He began to be seen as a leader. He was asked to settle arguments and to give advice, and Wang Lung was also proud of his sons could read. He depended on his sons to read contracts for him. He was proud when they found things that had to be changed in the writing. But one day, Wang Lung noticed that his eldest son was acting like a young lord. He sometimes did not go to school and instead acted in a lazy manner. Wang Lung was surprised, for he had never acted like that before. He had always been busy up at dawn and working all day. He was secretly proud of his son, that his son did not have to work so hard. He said to Olan, "I cannot buy a slave for him. I will find him a wife for him, and we will marry him early. We must do that right away." Then he rose and went into the inner court. The Good Earth, Chapter 8, Olan's Illness. When Lotus saw that Wang Lung was thinking of other things than herself, she pouted. She said to him, "It's only been a year. Now you look at me and you don't see me." If I had known this would happen, I would have stayed in the tea house. Wang Lung then took her hand and kissed it. He said, "Well, a man can't always be thinking of the jewel he has sewn inside his coat. But if it were lost, he could not bear it. These days I have been thinking of my eldest son. It is time for him to be married, and I do not know how to find a wife for him." Lotus told Wang Lung that she knew a grain merchant who used to come to the tea house. He had a daughter who looked something like Lotus, small and fine. He was a good man and always kind to the girls at the tea shop. She wasn't sure where he worked, so she called Kukua into the room. Kukua told Wang Lung that the grain merchant named Louis had his shop in the street of the stone bridge. Wang Lung struck his hands together in delight and said, "There, that is where I sell my grain. This is a good sign. It would be good luck to wed my son to the daughter of the man who buys my grain." Kukua smelled money in it as a rat smells cheese. She said, "I can make all the arrangements for you." She smiled at the thought of the merchant's matchmaking fee in her hand. But Wang Lung was not quite ready to make a decision. "I must think about this for a few days," he said. The next morning, though, he made up his mind for him. His eldest son came home after the sun was up. He had been out all night, drinking and having a good time with his uncle. When he saw the state of his son was in, Wang Lung knew he had to arrange the marriage soon. He went to Kukua and said, "Go to the grain merchant and arrange the matter." Then he went to his son's room and sat beside him as he slept. As he smelled the liquor on his son's breath, he became angry with his uncle. He thought, "I have taken in an ungrateful nest of snakes. Now they have bitten me." He found his uncle leaning over a table eating breakfast. He shouted at him, "Get out of my house, you and your family. From this moment on, there will be no more rice for any of you. I will burn this house down rather than have you in it. You have no gratitude, and you are ruining my son." But his uncle sat where he was and kept eating. He said, "Don't drive me out if you dare." Then his uncle opened his coat and showed what was against its lining. It was a false beard of red hair and the length of a red coat. Wang Lung stared at these things, and then he understood his real position. The red beard and the red cloth meant he was a member of a band of robbers. These robbers were thought nothing of burning down a man's house and carrying his women away. In all his years of good harvest, Wang Lung had never been robbed. Now he understood why. Wang Lung thought that he was protected by heaven. Now he knew that he would be safe only as long as he fed his uncle's family. As if he didn't have enough trouble, Kukua came in with the grain merchant with bad news. The grain merchant agreed his daughter would be married to Wang Lung's son, but she was only 14 years old, and the marriage would have to wait 3 years. Wang Lung was worried at the thought of 3 more years of the boy's idleness. He said to Olan, "Let us arrange marriages for the other children as soon as possible. I cannot go through this 3 more times." Wang Lung's troubles were too deep for him, as he usually did when this happened, he took a hoe and went out to his fields. As he passed through the outer courts, his elder girl sitting there smiling. She was twisting a bit of cloth through her fingers and smoothing it out. This simple act seemed to keep her busy. Wang Lung thought, "That poor fool brings me more comfort than all the others put together." Wang Lung went out to the land every day. One day, a small cloud came out of the south. It did not move as clouds blow by the wind do. The men in the village watched it and talked about it. Fear came over them, for they knew that must be a cloud of locusts. Wang Lung forgot all of his other troubles. To fight the locust, he would have to eat his crops. He worked day and night. He called his workers together. They set fire to some of the fields of wheat and dug wide moats around other fields and ran water into them. Some of the locusts fell into the fire and into the water. By the time the cloud of locusts moved on, Wang Lung had managed to save some of his crops. There were wheat to reap, and his young rice beds were spared. The locusts had forced him to think of nothing but his land. He was healed of his other troubles. He thought, "My uncle is older than I, and he will die soon. My son will get through these next 3 years until he is wed, and my life will go on." One day, after Wang Lung had said to himself that the peace in his house, his eldest son came to him. He said, "Father, I would like to go to a great school in the south. The old teacher in this town has no more to teach me." "You know enough for these parts. I say you cannot go," said Wang Lung. He looked at his son. His skin was smooth and golden. His hands were soft and fine as a woman's. Then he looked at himself. He was thick and stained with earth. He looked more like his son's servant than his father. This thought made him angry at his son. He shouted, "Go out into the fields and rub a little good earth on yourself so you'll look like a man. Work a little for the rice you eat." That evening, when Wang Lung was sitting beside Lotus, she said, "Your son is unhappy and he wants to go away." Wang Lung said, "How do you know that? I do not want him in these rooms at his age." Lotus told Wang Lung that she had heard it from Kukua, and Kukua said, "Anyone can see your son is unhappy." But Wang Lung said that he would not spend his money foolishly by sending his son away. For many days, nothing more was said about it. Then one evening, Olan came softly into his room, and she said to him, "Your eldest son often goes into the inner courts. When you are away, he goes. It would be better to send him away, even to the south." Wang Lung did not believe Olan at first, but then he remembered that Lotus had known that his son wanted to go away. How had she known? His son had also stopped talking about going away. He seemed more content now. Why was he so happy? Wang Lung decided to find out for himself. The next morning, he said loudly that he was going to town and would be back late. When he was gone halfway, he turned around and went back. He stood at the curtain and hung in the door to the inner court. He heard a man's voice. It was the voice of his own son. Full of anger that he had never known before, he went outside and got a piece of bamboo from the grove. Then he came back softly and suddenly tore inside the curtain. There was his son, standing in the court looking down at Lotus. Lotus sat on a small stool at the edge of her pool. They were talking and laughing. Wang Lung fell on his son, beating him with bamboo. When Lotus screamed and pulled at his arm, he beat at her too, until she ran into the room. When he was finished beating his son, he said, "Pack your things. Tomorrow you will go to the south. Do not come home until I send for you." When the eldest son was gone, Wang Lung felt better. He then decided to take his second son out of school and have him learn a trade. He arranged for the boy to work as an apprentice in Louis, the grain merchant. Louis. While he was talking to Louis about this, he also talked of arranging another marriage between their families and spoke of betrothing Wang Lung's 10-year-old daughter to Louis' 10-year-old son. The final decision would have to wait. This was not a thing to be discussed further. This was not a thing that could be discussed further face to face. Later that day, Wang Lung noticed that his 10-year-old daughter had been crying. When he asked her why, she said, "My mother has been binding my feet. Each day she ties the cloth more tightly. It hurts so much that I cannot sleep at night." "I have not heard you crying before," he said. "No," she said. "My mother says that I am not to cry in front of you. She said that you are too kind and weak for pain. If you saw me crying, you would tell her not to bind my feet, and then my husband would not love me, just as you do not love her." When Wang Lung heard this, he felt as if he were being stabbed. He thought of how Alan had been the first woman he had ever known. He thought of how she had been a faithful helper beside him. He thought of what the child had said, and he was sad. With all her dimness, Olan had seen the truth. Wang Lung was proud because he had 3 sons. One was a scholar, one was a merchant, and one was a farmer. Now he began to think of the woman who had given him these sons. He thought of her with a strange kind of sorrow. He saw that she had grown thin and her skin was dry. He remembered that sometimes in the morning he heard her groaning as she lit the oven. He wondered why she was moving more slowly these days, and he wondered at the strange swelling in her belly, even though she was not with child. One day he saw her face turn gray with some inner pain, and he asked her what it was, and she said, "It is only the old pain in my stomach." Seeing for the first time how sick she was, he told her to go to bed. He went to get a doctor, and after the doctor had examined Olan, he told Wang Lung what was wrong. "The spleen is enlarged, the liver is diseased. She has a large tumor in her womb, and her stomach has holes in it. Her heart is barely moving." Not wanting to tell Wang Lung that his wife would die soon, the doctor set a high price for a cure. For 10 silver pieces, he could prescribe a broth that would ease her pain, but it would take 5,000 pieces of silver to guarantee her recovery. Wang Lung looked at the doctor in sad silence. He would have to sell his land to get that much silver. He knew that the doctor was trying to tell him that Olan was dying. He went out with the doctor and paid him the 10 silver pieces. When the doctor was gone, Wang Lung went back to the dark kitchen and turned his face to the blackened wall and wept.